James Bennet stood tall and proud in his scarlet uniform outside Buckingham Palace. The heavy bearskin hat sat firmly on his head as he maintained his famous stoic expression. At 28 years old, James had served in the British Army for nearly a decade, but his position in the elite Royal Guard was his greatest achievement. The morning had started like any other. James woke at 4:30 a.m. in the barracks, prepared his immaculate uniform, and rehearsed the precise movements required for his 6-hour shift. His fellow guardsmen often joked that James could stand still longer than anyone else in the regiment. Like a statue carved from ebony, his commanding officer once remarked with respect. James took pride in his Jamaican heritage. His grandfather had come to Britain as part of the Windrush generation, serving in the Royal Air Force during challenging times when black servicemen faced daily discrimination. Now, 3 generations later, James stood guard at the palace, representing the best of Britain's modern military. "You're making history every day," his mother told him when he first earned his place in the Royal Guard. James carried those words with him during every shift, especially on difficult days. Today was unusually warm for London. Tourists gathered early, their cameras ready to capture the famous guards who never smiled, spoke, or reacted. James had learned to tune out the constant chatter, the occasional heckler, and even the children who sometimes made funny faces trying to make him laugh. "Remember, we're not just guards, we're symbols," his training officer had explained. "People see the uniform first, the person second." But for some visitors, James knew they saw his skin color before anything else. He had experienced the sideways glances, heard the whispered comments, and noticed when certain tourists specifically chose to take photos with his white colleagues instead. James never let it affect his performance. His stillness was a form of strength, his silence a powerful dignity. From his post, James could see the usual crowd forming. Tour groups from Japan, families from America, school children from local London schools, all excited to see the legendary guards in person. Most were respectful, staying behind the boundaries and observing quietly. Then James noticed a small group of men who stood out from the typical tourists. They were louder, drinking from water bottles that likely contained alcohol despite the early hour. One man in particular, wearing a bright Hawaiian shirt and sunglasses, kept looking in his direction and laughing with his friends. James maintained his focus straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the invisible point in the distance as trained. Years of military discipline had prepared him for all kinds of distractions. The loud tourist was nothing new. What James didn't know was that Richard Kelvin, the 45-year-old American in the Hawaiian shirt, had been drinking since breakfast. Richard had come to London with deeply held prejudices that he usually kept hidden back home in his small town. But here, anonymous in a foreign country, his inhibitions were fading with each drink. "Can't believe they let one of them guard the Queen," Richard mumbled to his friends, just loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. Several people frowned and moved away from his group. James heard the comment but remained perfectly still. This wasn't the first time he'd experienced racism during his duty, and he doubted it would be the last. His training had prepared him for this: maintain composure, focus on the duty, represent the uniform with honor. Little did James know that within the hour, this seemingly ordinary day would become anything but routine, and his years of training would be tested in ways he never expected. Richard Kelvin took another swig from his bottle and nudged his friend Mike. "Look at this guy, standing there like he owns the place," he said, pointing at James. The alcohol had loosened his tongue, and the false courage it provided made him bolder with each passing minute. The 4 American tourists had arrived in London just yesterday. Their trip began with the typical tourist activities: riding the London Eye, visiting Big Ben, and taking photos on Tower Bridge. But today, their 3rd day, the group had started drinking early at their hotel's breakfast buffet, mixing vodka into their orange juice when the staff wasn't looking. "Let's get closer," Richard suggested, pushing through the crowd of tourists. His friends followed reluctantly, already uncomfortable with his increasingly loud comments. The summer sun beat down on the palace grounds. Sweat formed on James's brow beneath his heavy bearskin hat, but he remained motionless. The weight of the scarlet uniform and the heat made his job even more challenging today, but years of discipline kept him focused. Richard and his friends positioned themselves directly in front of James. The other tourists, sensing trouble, began to create space around the American group. Parents pulled their children closer, and tour guides quietly directed their groups to other viewing spots. "Hey Mike, take a picture of me with the guard," Richard said, handing his phone to his friend. He stood next to James, not touching him but standing uncomfortably close. "This'll be funny. The guys back home won't believe they let someone like him guard the palace." Mike hesitated but took the photo. "Come on, Rich, let's check out the other guards," he suggested, trying to move his friend along. But Richard wasn't finished. The discomfort on the faces of other tourists only encouraged him. He enjoyed the attention, the feeling of power that came from making others uncomfortable. Back home in his job as a car dealership manager, Richard kept his views private, knowing they could cost him his position. But here, thousands of miles from home, he felt free to be his true self. "I bet they just put him here for the photos. You know, to look diverse for the tourists," Richard said loudly. "Can't be a real guard." A nearby British couple shook their heads in disgust. The woman stepped forward. "That's quite enough," she said firmly. "Show some respect." Richard turned to her, his face reddening. "Mind your own business, lady. I'm just having a conversation with my friends." James continued staring straight ahead, his expression unchanged. His training had prepared him for all kinds of distractions, weather, noise, even abusive tourists. Inside, though, James was counting his breaths, using the techniques he had learned to manage stress in difficult situations. One of the palace security officers, a plainclothed woman named Sarah, had noticed the commotion. She moved closer, keeping an eye on the situation while speaking quietly into her radio. "Possible disturbance at North Gate, American tourist harassing guard Bennett." Richard's friends were growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Come on, man," his friend Dave said. "Let's go find a pub. I'm thirsty." "Not yet," Richard insisted. "I paid good money to see these guards. I want to see if they really never move." His words were slightly slurred now, the morning's drinking clearly affecting him. James remained perfectly still, but he was fully aware of the escalating situation. His peripheral vision allowed him to see the security officer moving closer and the crowd's reaction to the drunk tourist. He knew the protocols: maintain position unless physically threatened or ordered otherwise by a superior officer. What Richard didn't understand was that the royal guards weren't simply decorative figures. They were elite soldiers, highly trained in combat and defense. The ceremonial uniform disguised the fact that each guard was a skilled military professional, capable of defending both themselves and the royal property they protected. As Richard stepped even closer to James, the situation was balanced on a knife's edge. The next few moments would test James's training, patience, and professionalism in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The crowd around James and Richard had grown larger now. People stopped to watch, sensing the tension building. Some took out their phones, recording the scene. Richard noticed this and seemed to enjoy the attention even more. "Hey you! Can you hear me in there?" Richard tapped his own head, mocking James's bearskin hat. "Or is your brain as black as your skin?" His voice carried across the courtyard, causing several gasps from the crowd. James remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward. Inside, his heart beat faster, but years of military discipline kept his face calm. He thought briefly of his grandfather, who had faced much worse during his time in service. "Never let them see they've hurt you," his grandfather had told him. "Your dignity is something they can never take." Sarah, the security officer, was now speaking more urgently into her radio, requesting backup at Northgate. Tourists becoming verbally abusive. She began moving through the crowd, trying to reach Richard before the situation escalated further. Richard's friend Mike grabbed his arm. "That's enough, man. You're making a scene." "So what?" Richard pulled away, nearly losing his balance. "That's what these guys are here for, to make a scene for the tourists." He turned back to James. "Isn't that right, buddy?" James continued his perfect stillness. The training manual was clear: maintain position unless physically threatened. Words, no matter how hurtful, did not qualify as a physical threat. A young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mummy, why is that man being so mean to the guard?" "Some people are just not very nice, darling," she replied, loud enough for Richard to hear. Richard spun around. "Oh, I'm the bad guy now? For what?" Talking, he turned back to James. "How does it feel wearing that uniform? Bet they had to make a special one just for you." The crowd was becoming more vocal now. "Leave him alone." Someone shouted. "Show some respect," called another. Richard's friends looked increasingly uncomfortable. Dave whispered, "Dude, there are kids watching. Come on." But Richard was too far gone, the alcohol and attention fueling his behavior. He stepped closer to James, now just inches from crossing the rope barrier that separated the public from the guards. "I bet your family was real proud when you got this job. First time anyone in your family had a real job, right?" Richard laughed at his own joke, looking around for approval, but finding only disgusted faces. Sarah had finally reached the group. "Sir, I need you to step back and lower your voice," she said firmly, showing her security badge. "Oh, look, they sent a woman to protect him," Richard sneered. "Can't fight his own battles." Sarah remained professional. "Sir, this is your final warning. Step back from the barrier or you will be removed from the palace grounds." Richard's friends took this opportunity to pull him away. "Come on, Rich. We're going to get arrested if you keep this up." For a moment, it seemed like Richard might listen. He took a half step back, and Sarah began to relax slightly. James continued his statuesque stance, giving no indication that he had heard any of the commotion. Then Richard suddenly jerked away from his friends. "Nah, I want to see if these guards are real." Before anyone could stop him, he ducked under the rope barrier, stepping into the restricted area. The crowd gasped. Crossing the barrier was a serious violation, one that could lead to immediate arrest. Sarah reached for Richard, but he was already moving toward James. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" Richard called out, now standing just feet away from James. "Are you even allowed to move? Or do they just wind you up in the morning and set you out here like a toy?" James remained still, but his training had prepared him for this exact scenario. The rules changed once a member of the public crossed the barrier. If the person approached within striking distance, guards were authorized to respond. Sarah was now calling urgently for backup. 2 more security officers were rushing across the courtyard, but they were still too far away. Richard took one more step forward, his face twisted in a mocking smile. He was now close enough that James could smell the alcohol on his breath. The crowd watched in tense silence, phones recording, as the moment balanced on a knife's edge. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" Richard said, now standing barely 2 feet from James. The crowd had fallen completely silent, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping around Buckingham Palace. James remained perfectly still, his eyes locked straight ahead. But his training had prepared him for exactly this situation. In his mind, he was already running through the protocol for dealing with a physical threat. His right hand gripped his rifle slightly tighter, though the movement was too subtle for anyone to notice. Sarah, the security officer, was now just steps away. "Sir, return behind the barrier immediately." Her voice was commanding, but Richard didn't even turn to look at her. "These guys are just for show," Richard announced to the crowd, waving his arm dramatically toward James. "They're not real soldiers. Probably couldn't even fight if they wanted to." Richard's friends had stopped trying to intervene. Mike had his face in his hands, unable to watch. Dave was recording everything on his phone, later claiming he wanted evidence for when we have to bail him out. The 4th friend, Tom, had already walked away, pretending not to know them. A palace tour guide nearby was quickly moving her group of schoolchildren away from the scene, but many tourists stayed, frozen in horrified fascination. An elderly British veteran in the crowd, wearing his service medals on his jacket, shook his head sadly. "I'm talking to you, buddy," Richard continued, his voice getting louder. He moved his face closer to James, trying to provoke any reaction. "Do they make you stand here because you couldn't handle real military work?" James's mind flashed briefly to his 2 tours in Afghanistan. The firefights, the lost comrades, the medals he kept in a small box back in his parents' home, but his expression revealed nothing. Sarah was now reaching for Richard's arm. "You're trespassing on royal property. You need tow." Richard jerked away from her grasp, stumbling slightly. As he regained his balance, his face twisted with anger. "Don't touch me," he shouted at Sarah. Then he turned back to James. "Is this what the great British military has come to? Hiring people like you to stand around like statues?" Richard's face was red now, spittle flying from his mouth as he shouted. "My grandfather fought alongside you Brits in the war. He'd be disgusted to see you wearing that uniform." James remained motionless, though his attention was now fully on Richard, tracking his every movement while maintaining his forward gaze. The protocol was clear: maintain position unless physically threatened. That moment came seconds later. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Richard suddenly reached out and shoved James's shoulder hard. Everything happened in a blur after that. In one swift motion, James stepped forward, his right foot moving behind Richard's leg while his left arm came up to block any potential follow-up strike. The move was practiced, precise, and controlled, exactly as he had been trained. "Kingsguard, stand back." James's voice boomed across the courtyard, the first words he had spoken during his entire shift. Richard, shocked by the sudden movement and command, stumbled backward. His heel caught on the uneven cobblestone, and he fell hard onto his back, the air knocked out of his lungs. James immediately resumed his guard position, his rifle now held defensively across his body rather than in the ceremonial stance. He hadn't struck Richard. There was no need. The trained defensive maneuver had been enough to protect himself while controlling the situation. The crowd erupted in gasps and exclamations. Dozens of phones captured the moment when the seemingly statue-like guard transformed into a moving, speaking soldier in less than a second. Richard lay on the ground, his mouth open in shock, staring up at James. Whatever he had expected, probably nothing at all. It certainly wasn't this swift, professional response. Two more security officers reached the scene, quickly moving to Richard's sides and helping him to his feet. His face had drained of color, the alcohol-induced confidence completely gone. What just happened?" Richard stammered, looking confused. "You assaulted a member of the King's Guard, sir," Sarah had explained coldly. "You're now being detained until police arrive." As the security officers led Richard away, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. James, however, had already returned to his post, standing perfectly still once more, his eyes fixed forward as if nothing had happened. Richard sat on a bench in the small security office at Buckingham Palace, his head in his hands. The room was plain with white walls and a single window that looked out onto an inner courtyard. Two Metropolitan Police officers stood by the door while Sarah completed paperwork at a desk. "I don't understand," Richard kept saying. "They're not supposed to move. That's their whole thing, right? They just stand there." One of the police officers, a tall man named Officer Jenkins, shook his head. "The Royal Guards are active duty soldiers, sir. They're not decorations. When you crossed that barrier and made physical contact, you assaulted a serving member of His Majesty's Armed Forces." The reality of his situation was finally starting to sink in for Richard. The alcohol was wearing off, leaving behind a pounding headache and growing anxiety. "Where are my friends?" Richard asked, looking around the room. "They're waiting outside," Sarah replied without looking up from her papers. "They've given their contact information and statements." Outside in the palace grounds, life had returned to normal. James continued his duty, standing motionless at his post. Most tourists would never know that anything unusual had happened just 30 minutes earlier, but several people who had witnessed the incident lingered nearby, hoping to catch another glimpse of the guardsman who had so professionally handled the situation. Among them was the elderly British veteran who had watched everything unfold. He approached another guard who was stationed nearby and asked to speak with a commanding officer. When a lieutenant appeared, the veteran introduced himself as Colonel William Harris, retired. "That young man showed exceptional discipline today," Colonel Harris said, nodding toward James's position. "I'd like to commend him personally, if possible." Back in the security office, Richard was being processed for arrest. "Am I going to jail?" he asked, his voice small now, all bravado gone. "You've been arrested for assault and trespassing on royal property," Officer Jenkins explained. "We'll transport you to the station for formal booking. You'll likely appear before a magistrate tomorrow morning." Richard's face paled further. "But I'm supposed to fly home tomorrow afternoon." "I'm afraid those plans may need to change, sir," the officer replied evenly. Meanwhile, at the changing of the guard ceremony, James' replacement arrived. The two guardsmen executed their precise movements, exchanging positions with mechanical precision. To the watching tourists, it looked like any other changing of the guard, but as the guards marched past each other, James' replacement gave him the slightest nod, a subtle acknowledgement of how well he had handled the situation. Released from his post, James marched away with the same discipline he had shown throughout the incident. Only when he was inside the guards' quarters did his expression finally change. He removed his bearskin hat and placed it carefully on its stand, then sat down heavily on a bench. "Heard you had some excitement out there today, Bennett," his sergeant said, entering the room. James nodded. "Nothing I couldn't handle, Sergeant." "The TO wants to see you," the sergeant replied. "And there's some brass waiting too." James felt a moment of concern. Had he done something wrong? Had his response been too much or too little? He had followed protocol exactly as trained, but he knew that incidents involving tourists could become complicated. He straightened his uniform and walked to the commanding officer's room, knocking sharply on the door. "Enter," called a voice from inside. James opened the door to find not only his commanding officer, but also a colonel he didn't recognize. Both men stood as he entered. "Guard Bennett reporting as ordered, sir," James said, standing at attention. His commanding officer, Captain Wilson, stepped forward with something unusual on his face, a smile. "At ease, Bennett," Captain Wilson said. "I'd like to introduce Colonel William Harris, retired. He witnessed the incident today and specifically asked to meet you." Colonel Harris, the elderly veteran who had been in the crowd, approached James with his hand extended. "Young man," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I served with the Royal Fusiliers for 30 years. What I saw today was British military discipline at its finest. You are a credit to that uniform." James shook the colonel's hand, surprised and moved by the unexpected praise. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. "I was just doing my duty." The videos of the incident spread across social media like wildfire. By evening, clips of Richard shoving James and the Guardsman's swift, professional response had been viewed millions of times. #RoyalGuard response was trending worldwide, with people from every corner of the globe commenting on James's perfect discipline and Richard's shocking behavior. In the guards' mess hall that evening, James sat quietly eating his dinner while his fellow guardsmen discussed the day's events. "Did you see the look on that tourist's face when Bennett moved?" laughed one of the younger guards. "I thought he was going to wet himself." Another guardsman clapped James on the shoulder. "Perfect textbook response, mate. They'll be using the video in training for years." James appreciated their support, but felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. He had always been a private person who took pride in doing his job well, not in receiving recognition for it. "Just did what any of you would have done," he said with a modest shrug, turning the conversation to the upcoming football match. Meanwhile, in a holding cell at the police station, Richard sat alone with his thoughts. His friends had visited briefly, but they seemed distant and uncomfortable. Mike had been the only one to speak honestly. "What you did was wrong, Rich," Mike had said before leaving. "Not just crossing the line, but all that racist stuff before. That's not the person I thought I knew." Richard hadn't responded, but the words stung because he knew they were true. With the alcohol completely out of his system now, shame was setting in. He remembered bits and pieces of what he had said to James, and each memory made him cringe harder. "I've really messed up," he whispered to himself in the empty cell. At Buckingham Palace, Captain Wilson was in an emergency meeting with palace officials and public relations staff. The videos had gone viral so quickly that they needed to prepare an official response. Guardsman Bennett followed protocol perfectly, Captain Wilson explained. He gave the verbal warning and used minimum necessary force to protect himself and the royal property. The palace PR director nodded. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive. Bennett is being hailed as a hero for his restraint and professionalism. "What about the racist elements?" asked another official. "Many of the comments online are discussing the racial aspect of the incident." Captain Wilson straightened in his chair. "Guardsman Bennett is an exemplary soldier who has served 2 tours in Afghanistan. His response today had nothing to do with race and everything to do with his training. He would have responded exactly the same way to any person who crossed that barrier and made physical contact." Back at his parents' home in South London, James's family gathered around the kitchen table, watching the news coverage of the incident. "That's our boy," James's father said proudly, his eyes glistening with emotion. James's mother squeezed her husband's hand. "Just like your father," she said softly. "Standing tall no matter what comes." James's younger sister was scrolling through her phone. "James, you're famous." Even celebrities are sharing the video and praising you." James, who had just arrived after finishing his shift, looked embarrassed. "Please, can we talk about something else? It was just one incident in one day." His grandmother, who had been quietly watching from her armchair, finally spoke up. "When your grandfather came to this country, he wasn't allowed in certain restaurants, even in his RAF uniform." Her voice was soft but clear. "Today, my grandson stands guard at the palace, and the whole world sees his dignity. That matters, James." The room fell silent as her words sank in. James nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this incident was about more than just him. At that moment, his phone rang. It was Captain Wilson. "Bennett," the captain said when James answered, "the palace wants to issue a statement about today's incident. They'd like to name you specifically and commend your response. I told them I'd need to check with you first." James took a deep breath, looking around at his family's proud faces. "That would be fine, sir," he replied. "Thank you." The next morning, Richard appeared before a magistrate in a small London courtroom. He looked nothing like the loud, confident tourist from the day before. His clothes were wrinkled from spending the night in a cell, and dark circles hung under his bloodshot eyes. "Mr. Kelvin, you are charged with assault on a member of His Majesty's Armed Forces and trespassing on royal property," the magistrate read from the papers before her. "How do you plead?" Richard's court-appointed solicitor stood beside him. "My client pleads guilty, Your Honor," he said, "and wishes to express his sincere remorse for his actions." The magistrate looked at Richard over her glasses. "Mr. Kelvin, do you understand that these are serious charges? The maximum penalty for assaulting a member of the armed forces while on duty is 6 months' imprisonment." Richard nodded, his face pale. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." The prosecutor stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, given the defendant's prompt guilty plea and lack of prior offenses, the Crown would not oppose a suspended sentence with appropriate fines and conditions." After considering for a moment, the magistrate delivered her ruling. "Mr. Kelvin, I sentence you to 3 months' imprisonment, suspended for 1 year. You will pay a fine of £5,000 and write a formal letter of apology to Guardsman Bennett. You are also prohibited from visiting any royal property for the duration of your suspended sentence." Richard nodded, relief washing over his face at avoiding jail time, though the fine would take most of his savings. "Mr. Kelvin," the magistrate added, her voice stern, "consider yourself fortunate. Your behavior was not only criminal but brought shame to your country. I suggest you use this experience to reflect on your actions and prejudices." Outside the courthouse, Richard faced another challenge, a small crowd of reporters waiting for him. His face burned with shame as cameras flashed and questions were shouted. "Mr. Kelvin, do you regret your racist comments? Will you apologize to Guardsman Bennett? How does it feel to be internet famous for all the wrong reasons?" Richard hurried past them without answering, his head down, rushing to the waiting taxi. Meanwhile, at Wellington Barracks, James was meeting with senior military officials. The incident had drawn attention to the Royal Guard protocols and the racial abuse some guardsmen faced. "Guardsman Bennett," the colonel said, "your handling of the situation was exemplary. The palace is very pleased with how you maintained both your dignity and the dignity of your position." James stood at attention. "Thank you, sir." "We would like you to consider taking on a special assignment," the colonel continued. "In light of this incident, we're reviewing our protocols for dealing with abusive tourists. Your experience would be invaluable." Before James could respond, another officer added, "Additionally, the Army's Diversity and Inclusion Committee has requested your input. Your response to this situation has resonated with many servicemen and women from minority backgrounds." James felt a mix of pride and uncertainty. He had never sought to be a spokesperson or symbol, but he understood the importance of what he was being asked to do. "I would be honored to help in any way I can, sir," he replied. Back in his hotel room, Richard sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank paper before him. He needed to write his apology letter to James, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain actions he himself didn't fully understand? His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Friends and family from home had seen the videos. His boss had left 3 voicemails, each more urgent than the last. The latest one had mentioned considering his position at the company. Richard's hands trembled as he finally began to write. "Dear Guardsman Bennett, There is no excuse for my behavior yesterday. The words I spoke and actions I took were inexcusable. I am deeply ashamed of the racist comments I made and the disrespect I showed to you, your uniform, and your service." He paused, tears forming in his eyes. The letter wouldn't undo what he had done, but it was a start. For the first time, Richard was truly seeing himself and his prejudices clearly, and he didn't like what he saw. As he continued writing, Richard made a silent promise to himself that when he returned home, things would be different. This humiliating experience had opened his eyes in ways he never expected. 6 months after the incident, James Bennett stood in full-dress uniform at the front of a classroom at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Before him sat 30 fresh-faced officer cadets, watching attentively as he explained the protocols for handling confrontational situations while on ceremonial duty. "The uniform carries weight beyond the person wearing it," James explained, his voice clear and confident. "When you stand guard, you represent centuries of tradition, but you are still a soldier first." In the back of the room, Captain Wilson nodded approvingly. James had grown into his new role as an instructor with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. The viral incident had opened unexpected doors for him, including this temporary teaching assignment and a promotion to Lance Corporal. "Questions?" James asked the cadets. A young woman raised her hand. "Sir, how did you remain so calm during the incident? The tourist was saying horrible things to you for several minutes before he crossed the line." James considered the question carefully. "I focused on my duty, not on his words. My grandfather taught me that dignity isn't about how others treat you. It's about how you carry yourself regardless of how you're treated." After the class, Captain Wilson approached James. "Good work today, Bennett. The cadets respect you. They've all seen the video, of course." James smiled slightly. "Thank you, sir, though I'm looking forward to returning to regular duty next month." "About that," Captain Wilson replied. "Headquarters called this morning. They're considering you for the sergeant's course next spring. Your incident report is now part of the official training materials." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in a community center in Boston, Richard Kelvin stood nervously at a podium. The room was filled with people attending a workshop titled "Confronting Our Biases: Personal Stories of Growth and Change." "My name is Richard," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "6 months ago, I was that guy you probably saw on the internet, the drunk American tourist who harassed and shoved a black Royal Guardsman in London." The room was silent as Richard continued. "I lost my job when I returned home. My girlfriend left me. Some friends stopped speaking to me, and I deserved all of it," he admitted. "That day in London wasn't just a bad moment. It was a mirror showing me who I'd really become." Richard explained how after returning home, he had entered counseling and joined an anti-racism workshop. The work wasn't easy. Facing his deep-seated prejudices meant confronting uncomfortable truths about his upbringing and the subtle ways racism had shaped his worldview. "I'm not here asking for forgiveness or claiming I'm some changed man," Richard said. "I'm still doing the work every day. But I wanted to share my story because sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to realize you need to climb up." After the workshop, a young black man approached Richard. "That took courage," he said, extending his hand. "Not many people would publicly own their mistakes like that." Richard shook his hand, still uncomfortable but learning to push through it. Guardsman Bennett showed more courage standing still than I ever did running my mouth. That evening, James sat with his family for Sunday dinner. His grandmother passed him a newspaper showing a small article about Richard's work with anti-racism groups in Boston. "Looks like some good came from that day after all," she said. James nodded thoughtfully. One moment doesn't define a person, what they do afterward might. His grandfather, who rarely spoke about his own experiences with racism during his military service, reached across the table and squeezed James's hand. "Proud of you, boy, not just for how you handled yourself that day, but for everything since." 2 lives had been changed by a brief encounter at Buckingham Palace. James Bennett had become not just a symbol of military discipline, but a quiet force for change within the institution he served. And Richard Kelvin, through the painful consequences of his worst moment, had found a path to becoming a better person than he had ever been before. The incident had lasted less than a minute. Its ripples would continue for years to come.